Greetings, people of the internet. Last week I was very lucky to travel down to Creative Assembly Studios in Horsham, and I got my grubby little mitts on the Three Kingdoms Gamescom build. The mission playthrough you're about to see is played on hard difficulty, and the game is also in romantic mode. Total War Three Kingdoms is based on a 14th century historical novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And whilst the game will come with a classic or authentic mode, the full experience will be in its romanticised mode. Basically history given a little poetic, mythical license. So some of the heroes might be a little unrealistically strong, slaying swaths of standard infantry, etc. Think House of Flying Daggers, and I feel like you'll be on the right page. I think this translates beautifully into a video game and helps flesh out the hero characters a little more when we can suspend our disbelief. Now that you've got a little background on the game, let's get to it. So, the mission I'm playing takes place when the son and daughter of one of the three faction leaders, Sun Jian, who many have described as an absolute lad, are ambushed. As soon as the mission starts, something new to Three Kingdoms and the Total War franchise is introduced: the ability to retreat at an extraction point when being ambushed. This allows you to take entire units off the field without any risk of some dying to RNG in the end battle screen after routing. I of course chose to stand and fight, dead to the last man or woman, because I consider anyone under my command expendable and my honour and glory absolute. As for what units I have to sacrifice, we have two general type characters, Sun Ren and Sun Quan, the daughter and son of Sun Jin, and a smattering of units that will feel somewhat familiar to a Total War player, but with a few interesting things as well. Let's take a deeper peek at some of those units we've got to play with. Firstly, we've got two mercenary infantry. These are sword and shield melee infantry who've got various stances. The shield wall seems particularly nice, which gives you a buff against cavalry charges and also incoming arrow fire. We have two Protectors of Heaven, which are pretty bog standard heavy spear infantry. Again, these come with a handful of stances. Next up are two mercenary cavalry. These are medium shot cavalry and pretty standard. Although they do come with diamond and arrow formations, the difference I couldn't really tell, but I didn't get too long with the game. Finally, we have two units of Azure Dragons. These are heavy spear infantry, but they also have short bows and fire arrows. They have an interesting formation where the front line of units keeps their spears out whilst the back line fires with arrows. Whilst this appealed to me visually, I didn't actually find it very practical, because the unit doesn't have very many fire arrows to begin with, and the front line wasn't very effective at shutting down a cavalry charge. Perhaps this is something that we'll be able to upgrade. I think fans of some of the older historical Total War games, as opposed to the newer Warhammer titles, will be pleasantly surprised to see a fairly comprehensive list of stances for each of the units. I think the most notable and useful are the loose and tight formations that make you less and more vulnerable to arrow fire and cavalry charges depending on the stance. There are also a few interesting static infantry stances, from shield walls as I mentioned before, to hollowed, square and circle formations, all offering various buffs and debuffs to various attacks. So let's get back to the ambush. I've set up my defensive lines as you can see, and I'm using fire arrows to return fire through the woods. As Sun Quan and my infantry are engaging the enemy that charged down the hill, I've sent Sun Ren and my cavalry around to the clearing to engage the archers and the enemy strategist. A strategist is apparently a very basic form of character that provides morale and a few other things for an army, but has no ability to enter any duels. What are duels, you ask? Well, more on that later. You've probably noticed by now that the map is at night. Total War Three Kingdoms is apparently introducing a day and night cycle which will be visible on the campaign map, a first for Total War. You may have also noticed the trees, which are quite ablaze. Buildings and trees can catch fire from fire arrows and various other things, which I imagine would cause morale damage and other debuffs to any units in the vicinity. Having dispatched the initial ambush, it's time to start moving towards the extraction point, or perhaps some more favourable ground as the second AI force starts coming onto the field. I'm just going to skip ahead slightly, as it does take 2 or 3 minutes for my units to wade across the river and get into position, and nothing else really goes on, so let's skip ahead. As you can see, I've made it across the river, but there are enemy forces coming from the extraction point, and also fresh units slowly crossing the river behind me. I decided to try and get my units up onto the hill to use the high elevation to gain a slight advantage. Unfortunately, due to my untimely decision making, or more likely, lazy infantry that refused to get a jog on, I'm kind of caught out by the force coming from the extraction point, who are on me faster than you could say, Jesus Christ, there's a massive force engaging our front lines. Not to worry though, Sun Quan and his buffs are going to keep my units nice and cushy, aren't you, Quan? In situations like this, it's really the job of the characters with their abilities to kind of get you out of a tight spot. Our character units come with various archetypes, and I'm told there are quite a lot to choose from in this Total War. Sun Quan is a commander who has a couple of buffs that he can enact on a wide area of effect. These make units around him more resistant to arrow fire, charging, and increase their morale. He's a fairly bland character in my opinion, but he's reliable and necessary for giving the bulk of your infantry an advantage. Sun Ren is a vanguard, which may as well mean out-of-hand baller. She has some very offensive actives, Heartseeker and Flames of the Phoenix. Firstly, let's talk about Flames of the Phoenix. This is an AoE slam attack that deals nice damage around her, knocking enemies down and away from Sun Ren. It's very good for disrupting enemy lines and also comes in handy for dealing a nice chunk of damage. Lastly, the best move of hers, in my opinion, is a single charged flaming arrow attack, Heartseeker. This deals huge damage to heroes, but can also skim through enemy lines and cause some nice damage. Personally, I'd save it for weakening enemy characters before dueling them. There are some downsides to this attack. It can miss if you are out of range, or if RNGesus doesn't bless your aim. It can also hurt friendly units, so you really do need to be careful you don't accidentally kill Sun Ren's loyal infantry, or heaven forbid her own brother. The eagle-eared amongst you may have just heard me mentioning duels. Dueling is another new feature for Total War 3 Kingdoms, which fits very nicely into the House of Flying Daggers style romanticised Chinese war theme. To initiate a duel, you simply select your character, click duel, and then select the enemy general you'd like to challenge to a 1v1. This will lock the two characters into a dance of death where they ignore everybody else on the field. They will continually trade blows until one emerges victorious. During the duel, you can also use any of the abilities that your characters may have as they come off cooldown. Duels can be a fight to the death, ensuring an enemy general is slain, or depending on the relationships between characters, they may choose to spare their victim upon defeating them. This is something that plays into the relationships mechanic for Total War 3 Kingdoms, and is also something you can see on the UI before you actually enact the duel. The idea of the narrative in this game is that within the civil war throughout China, many of these characters may be related, or have friends or enemies across the country. Actions made will affect those relationships, causing life and death motivations in actions such as dueling. When you win a duel, you will gain a buff for your army for the next 1 or 2 minutes. This can be very beneficial as the enemy have also just lost a general, meaning they'll be suffering a morale loss. Duels can obviously backfire, however. If you lose, your character could very well be permanently dead and your units will suffer a huge morale drop. Even in death though, our characters still serve. If Sun Ren was to be slain, Sun Quan would gain a rather large buff for a time. His outrage and grief at the loss of his sister would send him into a fury. This could turn an otherwise failing battle in your favour, but at a great cost. Finally, one last note on duels. If you were losing a duel and desperately wanted to save the character, you can use another hero to interrupt the duel. This comes at a cost, however, a debuff on the field and potential ramifications in the relationships due to such a dishonourable act. It really isn't looking good for me. I've lost a lot of units and there are seemingly many fresh spearmen engaging what I have left. The loss of the enemy generals eventually takes effect, and to my surprise, my forces managed to rout the enemy. Clearly, if this battle had been situated in a campaign rather than just being a demo, I'd have lost many units, but my generals would have gotten some good experience, and my enemy would have lost a general or two. As I mentioned before, I've been told that relationships between characters can cause campaign-wide reactions. Killing someone's brother may well create a new nemesis for you, and make a faction that was merely disgruntled with you before, hell-bent on your annihilation, or at least the specific general that ended their sibling, so as to enact revenge. It'll be interesting to see how much and how deep this mechanic goes in driving the narrative of a campaign. It's also important to note that I could have retreated using the extraction point, saving many of my units. But quite what the impact of that defeat would have in the campaign map, I'm unsure. Well, that's all from me folks, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do tap the like button, and if you're feeling particularly fruity, drop me a comment and tell me what you enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and expect lots of videos to be popping up on the channel in the next week or so as we scoop up troves of exclusive Gamescom footage whilst we're out in Germany. Until then, good noon!